Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising, your favorite podcast all about the evolution of revolution in Appalachia. I am sure that y'all have picked up on this by now, but I am a working class mom. I have a super supportive, amazing partner who you are going to be hearing from today for the very first time and is going to have a little bit of a segment with us on the show. It's going to be a very quick little trivia thing. We'll talk about that more later. But anyways, I am a working class mom and I have been traveling for my day job lately, so I know things have been a little bit wonky on social media especially, but I really appreciate your patience. And FYI, part of the reason that I do interviews is because that is not only a great way to lift up a freaking fantastic Appalachians who are doing awesome work, but it's also a good way to help me, out of selfish intent, provide good content to you, the listeners, while not necessarily working myself to death, because this podcast is not actually a stream of income, just so we're all clear on that. So if you know someone that we should feature on the show, please reach out to us at rednecksrising@gmail.com. That's spelled R-E-D, red, N-E-C-K-S, next, rising, R-I-S-I-N-G @gmail.com. So please feel free to reach out to us if you know somebody or yourself that we should feature on the show. That said, making a podcast is not free, and I absolutely could not do this without the support of the amazing folks who have thrown some appreciation our way over on our Ko-Fi page. That is our, it's kind of like a Patreon, and it's spelled K-O, like knockout-fi.com/rednecksrising. And this week we have some new supporters that I want to give a quick shout out to. And those folks are Ellen P., dear friend of mine who I've been following for a long time, also out here in Western North Carolina. Really appreciate you. We've got lovely Marikai. I probably said that totally wrong, and I'm so sorry. We've got our friend Pat, who I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much, Pat. We've got Sarah H. Thank you, Sarah. I hope that you enjoy the show. And then we've got my friend Erica Sunshine, and we're so excited to have you among our cornbread comrades over here at Rednecks Rising. One of the perks of supporting the show is that you get a shout out on the show as well as on our social media. And you know that your money, your financial contributions are going towards, one, paying for things like the publishing platform that we use to put the podcast out into the world, the equipment that we use to record, but also that we take half the income that comes in from the show and we donate it to an organization in Appalachia doing good work. So for the first month and a half until the end of July, we will be taking half of all of the income that comes in from the show and giving that to the Pulaski County Free Store that we interviewed in the second episode. We are really excited to support them. They do so much great work across Southwest Virginia, and Zoo was just a phenomenal person to have on the show, and I really want to have her back. So that said, you know that your contributions are going to a good cause. At the end of July, we will pick another organization for the month of August to put the contributions towards, and you can be a part of that by going over to our Ko-Fi page and becoming either a one-time contributor or a monthly subscriber, or you can also purchase some merch, which unfortunately at this point the limited edition launch merch and Pride merch has been taken down, but some new merch will be going up soon, so you can keep an eye out over there on the Ko-Fi for that. Hey, Christopher, I'm so excited. Every week I hear you're going to be sharing with us a fun little trivia question. So what you got for us today?
Hey, Chelsea. Trivia question for today is, what is currently the largest city in the Appalachian Mountains?
All right, the answer to this trivia question will be revealed at the end of the episode, so you got to stick around to figure out the answer. Okay, so when we left off on our journey down the rabbit hole of race and labor back in episode 3, we were just beginning to make our way into the 1700s after slavery had become fully institutionalized by way of the Virginia Slave Codes. If you have not listened to episode 3 yet, it's a doozy, and I personally recommend it, although I might be biased, but I recommend it not only because everything that I cover is just so damn interesting, but also because it's a great introduction to the material that we're going to dig into today, especially if you prefer your history lessons in chronological order. That said, it took a minute for me to decide what topic I wanted to cover in this next episode. I was trying to pick if I wanted to keep going in chronological order or if I wanted to skip ahead to some of the juicy material that comes with covering the coal miner and labor uprisings and the multiracial working class organizing that made all of that possible. So I ended up letting the people decide. By the people, I mean my Instagram followers, and you have spoken. So this episode is going to be all about the Coal Wars, and maybe I'll do a member-only episode on the Revolutionary War and the years that led up to the Coal Wars later on, or maybe it'll be public. Who knows? We'll see. For today, we're going to start by talking about a woman who was born less than 50 years after the end of the American Revolution. A woman that was born 7 years before Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, and who died on the eve of the New Deal. A woman who was alive when Andrew Jackson was president, and who sometimes quoted from speeches she heard Lincoln himself make. A woman who, as an adult, knew the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the First World War. She rode in automobiles, and she saw the railroads link the oceans. She saw and was seen in films and came to know the modern use of the telephone, the electric light, and the radio. She watched unions grow from secret groups of hunted men to what she feared was a complacent part of the establishment order. She spanned an incredible era in our country's history. It may have been, at times, a good time to live in America, but it was also a time in which one needed to fight very hard to survive. And the woman that we are talking about did just that. That woman was Mother Mary Jones. To millions of men, women, and children, she was a profane Joan of Arc, an industrial carried nation who took up the working folks' cause without question and fought without compromise. She was a pioneer of social change, and yet she was nonetheless adamantly opposed to women's suffrage. She really had no consistent philosophy except altruism and economic betterment. But when it comes to the details of Mother Mary Jones' life, we're going to have to dig into all of that in another episode, because today is about more than just old Mary. In the final decades of the 1800s, the country was undergoing a dramatic shift away from an agrarian economy towards an industrial one. And the vehicle for this shift was corporate capitalism. So we started seeing small-scale shops giving away to large corporate stores. Monopoly started to supplant competition, and the nature of work and of workers was being altered as a result. Waves of immigrants and displaced farmers were taking on work digging out coal and forging steel, and in return they were receiving starvation wages and nightmarish working conditions. And so as a result, unions began forming in the mid-19th century in response to the social and economic impact of the Industrial Revolution. The coal industry of the early 19th century had attracted miners from England, Scotland, and Wales, and by the 1840s, the Irish had become largely what was known as the new laboring class in the region. And as mines became deeper over the century, the work within them became less safe. And so by the time the Eastern and Southern European immigrants arrived, the coal operators were recruiting way more workers than they needed because they were purposefully creating pools of able-bodied men who could step in at very short notice to replace workers who were injured, dead, or striking from the mines. And having a significant amount of surplus labor allowed the elite executives and operators of the coal mines to keep wages and conditions that ultimately just couldn't sustain the families of the miners. So the year is 1873. There's all of this post-war speculation happening after the Civil War, and this bank house called J. Cook and Company suffers some pretty severe losses, which results in the bank house closing their doors. And as a result, this brought on a chain reaction of failures among smaller banks that depended on this bank house, J. Cook and Company. So overnight, the entire credit structure of the nation collapsed. 5,000 businesses fell by the end of the year, and the country overall suffered the worst depression that it had known up to that point. And for the next 6 years, unemployment rose and wages fell, and as a result, out of the 30 national labor organizations that had previously existed in 1873, which is unions, only 8 or 9 of those remained by 1877. And even of those 8 or 9, they had lost a ton of members. Mass demonstrations of the unemployed became super common, and while for a long time the American worker had been pretty peaceful, in the summer of 1877 they executed one of the most militant and successful strikes up to that time. And a lot of this labor organizing was centered on the railroads. And just to provide some context to the situation, one railroad official named Jay Gould went on record summing up his own labor relations philosophy in his own words, quote, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half," end quote. When there was another financial panic in 1876, wages were cut again, hard times followed again, and at the same time, dividends for railroad stockholders remained at 8 and 10%. So the wealthy elite, of course, made sure to keep bringing in their own bag, no matter who else was losing out in the process. Meanwhile, the rail workers, who often lived in shanties near the tracks, were working 15 to 18 hours a day, earning on average each week like $5 if they were able to get regular employment. And when the Pennsylvania Railroad cut wages by another 10% in 1877, and then other rail lines followed their lead, that really was the missing spark that the firework of labor organizing needed at that point in time. Underground unions surfaced, and then strikes, slowdowns, and confrontations started popping up at major rail centers all across the nation, including in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where around 1,200 brakemen and firemen had seized a depot and halted basically all of the traffic on the Baltimore and Ohio line. And all of the corruption and rate discrimination and abuse of public lands by the railroad execs had really just not done them any favors. So citizens from this cross-class multicultural group were really joining in on this fight against the railroad elite. Coal miners even near Martinsburg helped prevent the arrest of striking railroad leaders, and crowds of strikers in West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania blocked railroad tracks to keep scabs from running trains. And West Virginia Governor Henry M. Matthews, in reaction to that, sent state militia against the strikers. But the troops joined the strikers in open fraternization. It took a concerted effort to say that word, and I still probably did not get it right. But since the state militia was all buddy-buddy with the working class strikers, Governor Matthews ended up requesting federal troops from President Rutherford Hayes, and those soldiers became part of a precedent for the use of United States military to suppress the working class uprisings during peacetime. After 20 civilians were killed during one confrontation when troops fired into a crowd of people, an infuriated Pittsburgh crowd of about 20,000 forced soldiers to retreat to a Pennsylvania Railroad roundhouse that they then set on fire. And by August, strikes were ended after federal troops were sent to Pittsburgh in their first decisive strike-breaking role. So at the end of the day, the wealthy elite business owners had won, but they had also learned that the working class were a lot stronger than they had ever given them credit for. And in order to prevent collective organizing from the masses, because there were a whole lot more of the working class than there are of these wealthy elite, and they would pose a huge risk to the power and the wealth of this elite group of employers and owners. They realized that in order to prevent that type of collective organizing from happening, they would need more control over the militia, for one. Hello, control of the military state. For two, they would need an emphasis on open shop, which honestly I had to look up. And basically this is just like an emphasis on the right to be employed without participating in a union. And then they would also need conspiracy laws against the unions. And so while the wealthy elite were realizing that they were going to need to basically assert their dominance from all of these different directions, the workers, on the other hand, were basically just losing all faith in the government. They had been victim to the United States military being called in during an economic depression to defend the interests of the wealthy and the railroad industry. And it's just like this crushed their morale and faith in the government. I mean, when we think and really think, about the fact that our country was colonized for the purpose of producing profit for those who are already wealthy, then it makes total sense that like the government of this country that was founded for that purpose would protect the interest of those who intended to profit from the foundation of this country. But like, it's also just so, I don't know, exhausting, I guess, to just really dig into it because it's so clear. And I also think that in the modern day, it's easy to forget just how much our ancestors among the working class have fought and won through their collective organizing and their direct action. And I guess it's important to provide some perspective. So, let's just keep in mind that at this point in time, child labor was like still a thing. So much so that, just for context here, in the year 1900, about 30% of the Southern cotton mill workers were under 16 years old. So let's just go full circle here, all the way back to Mother Jones. Remember her? I was talking about her at the beginning of this episode, remember? So she did a sort of undercover investigation in the mills in Alabama, where during her investigation, she witnessed child labor and virtual borderline adult slavery being perpetuated and maintained by company store policies. Sometimes, she said, she had an urge to flee what she described as the most heart-wrenching spectacle in all life, to go to the coal fields, quote, where the labor fight is at least fought by grown men. She described children as young as 6 and 7 years old working for 14 and more hours per day and just enduring brutal working conditions that more often than not resulted in severe injury like losing an arm or another limb or death. And even though Mother Jones, had some problematic features, which, to be fair, so do I, and so do most of us if we really do some careful self-reflection, what I love about her is that she just fucking tells it like it is. In her own words, what she said were, quote, the children were half fed, half clothed, half housed, and they toil on, while the poodle dogs of their masters are petted and coddled and sleep on pillows of down. And the capitalistic judges jail the agitators that would dare to help these helpless ones to better their condition. And I've seen firsthand elected officials that would go to no end to stop good work that lifts up and improves the conditions of those who are the most vulnerable among us. So this does not surprise me at all. I guess it's just incredibly disappointing that individuals and systems like this that exist for nothing other than malicious purposes can still exist after so many centuries. Anyways, so at the end of the 19th century, miners from a bunch of different unions merged together to form the United Mine Workers Union, and Mother Jones dove headfirst into supporting that. If any place was home for Mother Jones, it was West Virginia. And during the 40-year time period and struggle to unionize the coal fields of West Virginia, Mother Jones was there on the front lines witnessing and participating in bloodletting and basically illicit guerrilla labor organizing tactics and just being a victim to ruthless aggression from the military state that was all about protecting the interests of these wealthy coal barons. And, just as a quick aside, is it any surprise or wonder that we have folks like Joe Manchin, modern day coal barons, participating in government affairs to protect their own self-interests after this long and winding journey of corruption for the sake of profit? I'm not surprised. Are you surprised? So anyways, West Virginia's output would rise almost 100-fold between 1870 and 1911. But because only about 10% of that output was actually being consumed within the state, wages had to be kept down to compete in markets in other areas. And the average annual wage of a miner in West Virginia was the lowest in the nation, with the only exception being in the Pittsburgh area, where immigrant labor was able to be exploited by capitalists for even lower wages. So the UMW's first attempts to organize strikes in the West Virginia mines were basically just mocked by the corporate elite, who brought in immigrants, black and brown folks, all in large numbers, to undermine strike efforts and replace any workers that attempted to strike, while also creating racial tensions among members of the working class to ultimately prevent collective organizing across race lines among the poorest laborers. So for me personally, when I think about the racial divisions that were very intentionally catalyzed by this capitalist elite class that depended on them to maintain a source of cheap labor at all costs, it makes sense to me then that the initial efforts of unions like the UMW were really concerned with protecting the jobs of native and naturalized workers in America, aka English speakers, really. And as far as poor English speakers in the working class were concerned, immigrants were really being brought in to undermine their efforts to achieve even like a crumb of dignity and security in the workplace. And so therefore, immigrants posed a threat to their well-being under this like competitive scarcity-based economic structure. And so it makes sense then, but it doesn't make it okay that the UMW supported policies like the 1897 Campbell Act, which levied a racist 3-cent a day state tax on coal operators for each non-U.S. citizen that they employed, basically. And of course, when the state tax was enacted, those wealthy coal operators passed that bill for that tax down to the non-naturalized miners in their employ because, of course, trickle-down economics and all of that stuff, right? That's how it works. And that ended up being the final straw for a lot of immigrant miners who organized what was intended to be a peaceful march in opposition to those crooked operations and the cruel exploitation of the coal operators. So the immigrant miners who decided to organize this peaceful march were met by 86 deputies joined by coal company police who collectively lined the sides of the road armed with rifles and pistols. And the law enforcement officers ordered the miners to abandon the march, and some miners pushed forward, someone yelled fire, and several men immediately fell dead in their tracks. The rest of the miners turned and began to run away, but law enforcement continued firing for 2 full minutes, and over a dozen protesters were shot in the back while fleeing. This is what is now known as the Lattimer Massacre. And in the Lattimer Massacre, more than 24 men died. The slain strikers were buried in 4 different cemeteries, most in paupers' graves. And a Polish newspaper wrote of the strikers, quote, "May their death not be in vain. May they become the patron saints of the working people in America," end quote. Law enforcement leaders and deputies were tried, but get this, they were only tried for the death of a single striker. Remember, more than 24 men died, ultimately. And regardless of how many deaths they were tried for, it didn't even matter because they were found innocent after their defense attorneys characterized the miners as, quote, invaders from the steppes of Hungary, end quote, who had come to America to destroy peace and liberty. The defense team was so good at leveraging the prejudices that were just perfectly fitting for this country that was being maintained by division among the many for the purpose of profit for the few, that they successfully created an entire alternative narrative built on those prejudices. What some of us today might refer to as whitewashing, or maybe, I guess in this case, would it be like capitalist washing? But just for one example, Century Magazine published a series of articles that described the miners in a racist, condescending tone, recounting quote, the scene of the attack on the deputies, end quote. So this backlash against the immigrant miners ended up growing so immensely that in a couple of years, the president of the United Mine Workers of America, John Mitchell, ended up including a specific plea for a more inclusive union when he called for a strike. And he said, the coal you dig isn't Slavish or Polish or Irish coal. It's just coal. And that phrase ended up becoming a rallying slogan for some of the more famous strikes that came about in the following years that ended up winning better working conditions, shorter workday, wage hikes, and so on. And with increasing support from the collective foreign-born workers, the United Mine Workers began to really recognize this Lattimer Massacre as an event that cemented a new layer of immigrant loyalty to the labor union. But labor organizers were still against an uphill battle as they faced the raising of wages and the paying of bonuses for those who stayed on the job during strikes. They were facing evictions from company-owned homes. They were facing state violence and armed forces used for intimidation. And of course, like we've already talked about, they were facing the court system's dedication to protecting the interests of the elite capitalists. And to add to the general political advantage afforded to the coal barons, because the coal properties in West Virginia and the Appalachians were rarely near established towns, mining companies ended up building whole communities from the ground up, which meant they had complete control over those communities. So there's this historian named Herbert Harris who described a company-controlled town and said, quote, "Since it owned the streets, it could forbid freedom of speech and assembly. Since it often owned even the highways leading to and from the mining center, it could prevent union organizers from entering its domain. For all practical purposes, the company also owned the mayor, village or town council, the judge, the jury, the court crier, and whatever press existed. Boys were brought into the world by the company doctor, attended the company schools, listened to the sermons by the company preacher, grew into manhood and worked in the company breaker or washery, and finally were buried by the company undertaker." And honestly, total aside here, but this is like the first thing that comes to mind for me when folks have been sharing this stuff about like employers who are willing to cover the cost of travel for an abortion. Like, I don't want to have to tell my employer if I'm having an abortion. What? Like, that's literally none of their business. I don't want my employer to have to know anything about my medical history. I don't want my employer to know where I live other than for tax purposes, honestly. Because I have seen employers do some pretty fucked up shit, and history has shown that people in positions of power do not have our best interest at mind. And the more control they have, the more they will use that control to exploit our entire existence. Woo, stepping down from my soapbox now. We are coming back again, full circle, to Mother Jones, who set out at the beginning of the 1900s to light a mostly metaphorical but somewhat literal fire underneath the labor organizing efforts that were going on in West Virginia at the time. In a typical meeting scenario with hundreds of West Virginia miners, she would be recorded as saying something along the lines of, "Has anyone ever told you, my children, about the lives you are living here so that you may understand how it is you pass your days on earth? Let us consider this together, for I am one of you, and I know what it is to suffer." Typically, she would paint the picture of the life of a miner from boyhood to death. She would describe the work in the dismal caves beneath the earth, with vivid imagery about the dripping with moisture, so low that they must crawl in, lie on their back to dig, and allow the sulfur water to eat through their shoes and raise sores on their flesh. She recanted for the miners how specifically their hands would become cracked and gnarled and their nails broken off, and how the scrapes in the lunch pail failed to satisfy, and how the thought of their barefoot children and their broken mother haunted them even when they crawled through the bowels of the earth. She would describe situations of miners that had to scrub the coal dust from their tired body every night and listen to their wives tell of what the children need but could never have. And Mother Jones reminded the workers they could never own a home or make their wife happy or educate their children. She would say, they must rise again tomorrow and do it all over again, unless, of course, the fall of rock gets them, or rheumatism cripples them, or unless the job itself is there no longer. And then Mother Jones had this habit of raising her voice, and she would ask them why others, no more sons of God than they, took from the toiler all the wealth that they produced, leaving those workers only enough to subsist so that the labor they provided could further advantage the wealthy. You pity yourselves, she would say, but you do not pity your brothers, or you would stand together to help one another. She would call for them to wake up so they might live another better life. Later, in a speech she gave near Clarksburg, the federal marshal began arresting organizers in the crowd and sent word to Mother Jones that she too was under arrest. But she refused to stop talking. Honestly, a woman after my own heart, truly. She accused Judge Jackson, as well as the newspapers, mainstream media, and the railroads of being in cahoots with the coal operators. The federal judge is a scab anyhow, she is quoted as saying. While you starve, he plays golf. While you serve humanity, he serves injunctions for the money powers. And it's always been true that the socio-political institutions that have been developed under capitalism have been designed to protect power and wealth under capitalism. So, that's not surprising. I guess it's just pretty crazy how successful propaganda has been at erasing that fact from mainstream knowledge. And also, can we just bring back using the term scab to describe anyone who undermines the best interest of working class folks? Can we use bootlicker and scab on the regular? For real. By 1912, a full-on war was in the making in the coal fields of West Virginia. And at the center of the catalyst to this war were two streams, 8 miles apart and separated by a mountain ridge, Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. While Paint Creek had remained a Union stronghold since the beginning of the century, the coal operators in Cabin Creek had successfully prevented the Union from gaining a foothold there. And so a bitter, bloody, brutal battle ensued between the divided laborers. Eventually, the working class folks in Cabin Creek joined the Union efforts, and then Mother Jones called for the abolition of the mine guards, and then the Union members armed themselves. And by September of that same year, 1912, shootings were happening on a nightly basis, and Governor Glasscock declared the entire strike zone to be under martial law, bringing 1,200 militiamen into the creeks. Overall, the mine war in the Paint and Cabin Creeks field went on for 14 months. During that time period, there were some 30,000 shots that were estimated to have been fired, and there were around 50 people that were left dead as a result. The Union's membership more than doubled in the state of West Virginia during that time, and the United Mine Workers of America leadership soon began organizing the New River District, which unionized for the first time by 1915. And by the end of the First World War, about 1/2 of West Virginia's mines would be unionized. which I think is probably a great place to wrap up for today. As usual, I've covered a lot of information, and it's been a truly wild ride with my ADHD as your own personal tour guide. But I hope that what you're at least picking up on is this pattern, this thread of the rich and powerful using whatever platforms are available to them to leverage race baiting as a means of keeping members of the working class divided. The mainstream media and the narratives pitched by news sources, policies that intentionally target particular groups of people like immigrants to avoid addressing the root issue of labor exploitation, and so on and so forth. And why? Who benefits from all of these different platforms jumping into these race-baiting divisive narratives? Well, who benefits are the people who depend on us to produce wealth for them, the rich and powerful, the corporate elite, the ownership class, the people who make their money off of poverty-level paychecks, corporate greed and subsidies, and political manipulation, the people who know that the working class far outnumber them. And honestly, sometimes I feel like I'm straight up in the Matrix because it's all so just obviously connected and coordinated, and yet somehow the propaganda is strong enough to prevent us from seeing it. So, anyways, I gotta catch myself before I go off on a whole other tangent. That is enough for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Rednecks Rising. We will be back next week with another interview with a fierce Appalachian that's doing good work in our region, and you'll definitely want to hear this one. So don't forget to hit subscribe. Keep an eye out for that to drop. Follow us on our Ko-Fi. You can follow us for no cost, but you can also throw some money our way if you want to help keep the podcast live, and you'll be able to access merch and all kinds of cool stuff over there. Thanks so much. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next Tuesday. And if you made it this far, then naturally, we gotta give you a little bit of a reward, and that reward is the answer to today's trivia question.
And your answer for your trivia question today is Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of Rednecks Rising. I totally want to hear your feedback, so please do not hesitate to reach out via Gmail at rednecksrising@gmail.com. I spelled out the Gmail at the beginning of this episode, so please rewind if you missed that. You can also get in touch with me on social media. It's Rednecks Rising on all platforms. On Twitter, there's an _after the name. And then on Facebook, Rednecks is spelled with an X in place of the CKS. So reach out, get in touch. Let's have an interview, support the podcast. If you want to support us financially so that you can help me pay for my Spreaker subscription or equipment that I use to record this, you can go over to Ko-Fi, which is KO like knockout -fi.com/Rednecks Rising, spelled out full words, no uppercase letters, no special characters. And yeah, y'all are amazing, and I appreciate you so much. I cannot wait to talk to you again next week.